Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Adam Kucharski, who is a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also the author of a couple books. This new book is called Proof, The Art and Science of Certainty, preceded by this one, The Rules of Contagion, which I think I have to commend you. Perfect timing on this book. It came out, was 2018 or 2019?
It was early 2020, actually. Yeah, it was very, very strange how it all lined up.
Yeah, I'm guessing that if you had time, you would have said, halt the presses, let's go back and add a few chapters, but you probably didn't have time to write them.
I think we did. I think for the paperback, we added a bit more, but I think, given how quickly things were changing in that, I think it was just useful to kind of have it out there as it was.
Right. And then before that, you have this book called The Perfect Bet, How Science and Math Are Taking the Luck Out of Gambling. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
So in this book, Proof, it's pretty wide-ranging, right? And you talk about all the different ways that you can, quote, prove something, which I think it sort of blurs into the concept of ways that you can convince people of things, right? Because we use this word proof in so many different ways. I think for those of us who have a mathematical background, we have this canonical method of proof that Euclid used. But of course, in daily life, right, we rely on lots of other forms of proof, particularly in, say, the court of law or in a practical field like medicine, where, you have to make decisions. And I teach in strategy in business, and a lot of my students who are engineering background or, scientific background, they're very uncomfortable with this notion that, you have to make decisions right, based on evidence, but without any kind of certainty around what they're encountering. And so, is it kind of curious that we have this word proof that is used in so many different contexts? Should we come up with different names for all these different ways of, achieving knowledge?
Yeah, and I think one of the motivations for writing Proof was, first of all, I see it as slightly different to just gradually accumulating knowledge and truth about the world. Because often in situations where we've got to prove something, there's a sense of urgency, whether it's a decision we have to make, whether you've got someone on trial, whether it's a scientific situation, whether you're diagnosing a patient, for example. So I was really interested in, first of all, just the links between those fields, how ideas have transitioned across, in some cases where they've gone quite badly wrong as they've moved from one field to another. But also, my background's in maths originally. So I've sort of come up with this idea, I think, starting out, that we have this certainty and you have this proof. And I think mathematics often has this reputation that once that theorem's proved, we're done and we can just kind of move on and build on it. But even digging into the history, I think, as you kind of go deeper into the subjects, that really at times has completely unraveled. As you mentioned, Euclid was really one of these early mathematicians who laid this idea that we could have universal truth. So prior to the ancient Greeks, Babylonians, for example, would use mathematical calculations, but in a much more pragmatic way. It was kind of, I've got this problem, can I do some calculations to solve it? So if they want the area of a circle, it was about 3 times the radius squared. There wasn't this kind of universal constant like pi that would be true no matter how detailed you'd go. But then in the 19th century, there was this transition that mathematicians started to challenge some of these kind of self-evident or seemingly obvious theorems, and even the concept of geometry. If you have a triangle and you draw it on a sphere, a lot of these properties that you learn in Euclid's theorems don't hold in the same way. And it now sounds quite simple, but actually it's remarkably controversial, because a lot of this was also just tied up with the idea that you could have this universal truth. Newton, a lot of it had a religious element, this idea that you had this kind of divine balance in the world, and he was discovering it. So the idea that actually a lot of maths just depends on human assumptions and how we frame the problem was extremely disruptive. But obviously now we know everything from Einstein's relativity to a lot of the work we do in kind of modern probability all relies on people challenging the idea that there was that very simple certainty. So for me, that was a kind of launch-off point, that even if the most certain of certain fields can have these challenges, what does that mean as we start moving into, law and medicine and science and AI?
Yeah, it seems like when you move into the practical sciences, Right. I mean, you have to adopt a much more, I don't know, perspectival view, right? Or you have to be comfortable with lots of different models. But it seems like people who are schooled in math, they find themselves in domains like finance. You write a lot about finance. I'm much more familiar with finance than epidemiology, for instance. And it seems like when folks move into that field from a background in math, they maybe have a greater tendency to fall in love with their models than, than people who come at it from a different direction. I mean, this seems to be a problem, this idea that you fall in love with your model. I think it was George Box, right, that made that famous quote.
Statisticians are like artists, that they have this bad habit of falling in love with models. And it is something that we see across fields. That you have the kind of abstract purity of the simplified world, and that can in many cases be really useful. But even finance, the equation used to price options, there's a load of really nice maths behind that, but everyone knows that that's not really how the world works, even though it's a very kind of useful tool to build on. And I think there's often this tension between this search for perfection and just the pragmatism of things that are useful. Even in statistics, if you look back about 100 years, there was this real debate between, on the one hand, the kind of the academic side that would say, well, if we don't have extremely strong evidence, we just don't know. We just sit on the fence, don't have to make a decision. And it was actually people like William Gossett, who was he ended up being a chief brewer at Guinness, and he was really an early pioneer of experimental design, and particularly how you make sense of small data. So Guinness at the time were industrializing their brewing process, manufacturing huge numbers of pints relative to what they were having. So they had to think about quality control, think about statistics, think about knowledge. And Gossett didn't have the benefit of just sitting on the fence. Decisions had to be made. Not taking a choice as a business is taking a choice. And so he was much more pragmatic, and he thought, well, actually, what's the strength of the evidence? But equally, what's the business decision that's riding on it? How much does it cost me to go out and collect more evidence? And thinking much more pragmatically about the circumstances he was working in. So I think even within quite seemingly theoretical subjects, there's been those different outlooks. I think actually Gossett's outlook got lost for quite a lot of the 20th century. I think we ended up with this statistical idea of, if it's not significant, if it doesn't reach this threshold, we just don't do anything. But of course, most of life, you have to make a choice, and you might have to make that choice with quite weak evidence. And I think that's where the kind of theory can clash with the reality.
Yeah, I always have this tension in teaching a business, because we usually start off at the very beginning of the MBA program teaching people statistics and inference. And, they learn about p-values and, the null hypothesis and all that basic stuff. And they say, look, if you fail to meet the test, then you can't really say anything with confidence. But then we're asking them to make all sorts of decisions. Right? And I say, if you need a p-value below 5%, you're never going to get out of bed in the morning. And so you were kind of at the thick of things in the pandemic response. And it seems like there were two different things going on. There was the scientific discussion, where people were very reluctant to make claims in the absence of definitive proof. But then there was this kind of practical public health response where you had to kind of make decisions in the fog of war. I mean, did you feel that tension, in the discussions? Did the policymakers and the scientists kind of have different ways of looking at the world?
I think there was. And I think, part of the ability, I think, to be useful as a scientist in forming policy is understanding the constraints under which they make. So even just the sort of time lags involved, that giving someone an answer that's 80% right now so they can make a decision off the back of it is much better than going away and spending 6 months and getting something that's that higher confidence, because often it does have that imperfection, but people kind of need more than what would just be effectively guesswork. I think also, if you rely, and I think it's always important to accept that you might change your outlook and you might accumulate more evidence, and think about, there's a lot of work on what data do we need to be able to make these decisions in a better way. And actually, one of the reasons I think early on in March 2020, a lot of countries got into a lot of trouble is they just had no idea what was going on. And they had emerging evidence about severity, these kind of data points. They didn't actually know what was going on within their country. But if you demand a very high level of certainty, it typically biases you towards inaction. Because if you say, I'm going to stick with the status quo unless I have a lot of confidence about anything I'm going to do, your natural response is to not do anything. So that in itself is is a decision. And you might have actually quite strong evidence that that decision is going to lead to a bunch of bad outcomes. I think one of the challenges we had in COVID is this dimension of a problem where all directions had a lot of enormous downsides, and countries were having to make that under pressure. And even one of the things that I think I didn't really appreciate at the time was even later in the year, when a lot of these questions about the severity, a lot of these questions about transmission had really been resolved because we had much better data, we still had a lot of this tension demanding, we can't be sure about something, or we need much higher evidence. And I think that is the gap between where kind of science lies and where policy lies. And I think also just in terms of people's perception of what science can do. So I think I've always thought about it very much in terms of our work. We can say what's happening. We can help inform decisions about, if you do this thing, this is what we think the effects might be. But that top layer of this is what you should do, I think is very much, that's a policymaker, that's a decision maker does that bit. I don't think scientists generally should be at that point. And one of the things I found really interesting researching the book was even going back in history. So smoking and cancer was another really good example where there was uncertainty, because you can't run a proper randomized trial. You can't make people randomly take up smoking and then wait 30 years and see if they get cancer. But there was this strength of evidence to say, well, we kind of have to act on the evidence available. But Austin Bradford Hill, who's one of the key figures in compiling that evidence, was very adamant that it wasn't his job to tell people how to live their lives. So I think as well as that communication of uncertainty, I think it's also just important to think about where that role of generating evidence ends and actually where that much harder process of decision making begins.
Well, I mean, it seems like having a high burden of proof doesn't default you to inaction as much as it defaults you into the default course of action, right? Based on your priors about what you believe is happening. So, for instance, when COVID hit, I think a lot of public health officials had a working model that was designed for flu epidemics, right? And so that was kind of more the default response to respond to the kind of epidemics that had been planned for. Is there a degree to which that kicks in?
I think there was also just, so I think the 1918 pandemic loomed very large in the kind of prior beliefs about respiratory outbreaks. And there's a lot of work that's been done. In the US, there were a lot of closures. It's kind of fascinating actually looking back at the history that in 1918, there's arguments about masks. There's arguments about which bit of society you should close. A lot of these, you could almost just pull them out of newspaper articles today in terms of what was written. But although there were shutdowns, there was still enormous epidemics. So essentially, it was accumulation of immunity. It was a lot of deaths. Eventually, some immunity accumulated, and that's what ended a lot of these outbreaks, even if the closures lowered it slightly. And then that became the working assumption that you can slow these things a bit, but you can't stop them. And you're going to get a very large epidemic. Maybe you can slow the worst of it, but that's kind of where you are. And COVID, in a very dramatic way, we saw what China did as a policy, and then many other countries, this shift of, actually, it is possible to stop it. It's extremely expensive and disruptive to do that, but that working assumption about what pandemics can and can't do was wrong. But then you've got the challenge of this intervention is just society changing. And so what do you do with that? And I think we saw in real time a lot of countries trying to grapple with that realization that they had this option they didn't think they had, but it was an option which certainly outside of an emergency, nobody would ever think feasible to use.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think at the very beginning of the pandemic, you were involved in some simulations, right? Working out some models as to what could potentially happen. And it seems like there's been this tension going way back to the early days of statistics between sort of the descriptive approach and the mechanistic approach, right? And so even today, when you're modeling a pandemic or modeling a financial crisis or earthquakes and so forth, it seems like there are these structural models, and then there are these empirical models. And, your decision is a result of the dialogue between these two, right? How does that tension manifest itself? Is it just about figuring out the right way to calibrate things?
Yeah, and I sort of don't see it so much as I think some people have you've got the sort of data and the descriptive statistics on one side, and you've got the models and the theory on the other side. But often, if we're looking at an epidemic, if you look at an increasing epidemic curve, any opinion you have about that, there's some underlying, even if you look at the data, because that's not the epidemic, that's some generation process has given you those cases, and they're probably delayed, they're reflecting early infections, there's going to be some uncertainty, days of the week, all this kind of stuff. So there's this kind of layer of a data generation model, and in many cases it might be an extremely simple one that you can just put into a statistical model and just have it as like an error term or something fairly simple that can capture it. But I think one of the reasons, particularly for disease epidemics, it's very hard to avoid using a more detailed model is particularly the kind of the non-linear aspects we have. So, for example, if an epidemic's going up, it won't just keep going up forever, because for something like flu or COVID, you will eventually get immunity accumulating in that population, certainly in the short term. So the epidemic will start coming down. So in other words, when you're at the early stage, more infections means more infections, but then when we're at the later stage, more infections means less infections. So actually you kind of have to start including some of that process. Otherwise you get very strange results. I think, ideally, a lot of my job basically consists of trying to avoid using models. I'd love to have, if you look at when you see remarkable clinical trial data where it's that's the people without the intervention, that's the people with the intervention. You're like, okay, you can see that that's a huge effect. But I think a lot of our work, because we deal with these unobserved processes, and because we deal with these kind of interactions, whether it's like an immune response within host that kind of comes up and down, or whether it's population level epidemic, it's very hard to start leaving those out. And especially a question of what does an uncontrolled COVID epidemic look like, you're going to have to account for the fact you're going to get these infections and some immune response accumulating over time. So I think in the early stages, you can sort of swap between these two approaches because it doesn't really matter. But especially in the later stages, you kind of either implicitly or in some way writing it down in form of equations, you have to start thinking about the generation behind these. And then, I think it's the ability to obviously just make sure what you're putting in that is reasonable.
Well, and it seems like trying to understand an epidemic like COVID, your hands are kind of tied because you can't really do too many RCTs, right? You can imagine a world where you could do a bunch of challenge trials, and this would tell you a little bit more about, transmission dynamics and so forth. But it seems like that was sort of off the table, right? We didn't do a lot of RCT. I think there were a couple involving masks and a couple, obviously, with the vaccine and so forth. But could we use perhaps more RCTs to understand these dynamics?
I think we could have, and I think it's very hard to do something when the epidemic's going up, because I think that idea that we're going to introduce things in a staged way or something. I think that is always very difficult in an emergency situation. But I think there were a lot of missed opportunities to not learn something. Particularly as measures were being lifted, for example. That for the sake of you could lift some things a bit earlier, some things a bit later, and have some element of random. Ultimately, the benefit of randomization is it takes a lot of the complexity about the world and just wraps it up in an error term, because on average you get a balance out between those groups. And so what we instead have is a lot of observational data where people say, well, actually that was a different place and those people were behaving differently for these reasons. And when they ran, some of them were quite controversial. So one of the few randomized trials of sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions, apart from some of the mass trials you mentioned, was in the UK. There's a trial comparing, do we have people just in quarantine, or do we give them a rapid test every single day? And then if they're negative, they go out and do their thing. If they're positive, then they isolate. And the burden of keeping people in quarantine, and effectively a lockdown is just a quarantine with the policy, everyone's in quarantine. So it's a really kind of damaging, disruptive measure to have. So the idea that actually I can just give you a couple of boxes of tests and you can go about your life and then just isolate if you don't. Because most people who are quarantining, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, it was probably about sort of 95% of them were never infected. But just because we couldn't have that kind of individual information on them. So again, that was a trial that showed that actually there wasn't much difference between the arms. So in other words, giving people rapid tests was kind of similar to a blanket quarantine, and probably you might get a bit more adherence. But I think it's also just the feasibility of the design. We looked at it, so for example, with like some sports teams and the idea of if you have, sports events at different capacities and this sort of thing. And some of them, particularly when I think when people are most open to running trials is when the epidemic's at quite low levels. So what we found was when we ran the numbers, to get a strong signal, you'd basically have to run the entire sports season. So I think we were like, you're going to have to run dozens and dozens. I mean, actually, the other data that we did quite a lot of work with, so a place like Singapore that ran a lot of pilot events, so they put little kind of tags on people so you could monitor all the interactions, but they didn't have much COVID. So you had this challenge with some places that are collecting amazing data, didn't have many infections. Some places, lots of infections, but basically if you've got lots of infections, it probably means that you're not following up where they are very well. But I think there's a lot of debates we're still having and we shouldn't be having really. We should have learned a lot more, I think. I mean, one of the stats that really stands out for me is in the UK, we gave out rapid tests, so you could get them for free. You get a box sent to you for free every day if you wanted. So in the first sort of, I think about 18 months, 1.7 billion tests were given out for free. And we didn't really embed many studies or learn much from that. So I think that was when I saw that, I was like, we could have learned surely a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, we see that in business all the time. Like if you're going to roll something out, roll it out in a rigorous way so that you can actually learn something, right? And a lot of people say, oh, well, why would I want to do that? Well, if you're resource constrained, you're not going to roll it out to everybody at once. And so why not do it in a way that leads to discovery?
I think that's a really good point. One of the things that really stood out for me in the book was talking to people who work both on the medical side, but also just on the kind of trials in policy. And this point of, as you said, if you're resource constrained, it actually opens up an ethical way because you're like, I can't do this for everybody. So in a way, randomizing and learning something, which you might not want to do if you've got enough treatment for everybody, suddenly it's kind of ethical because you want to benefit future people.
Yeah, I mean, I always think in business, if you have a model, right, your model is based on all these different assumptions. And so, you do sensitivity analysis on all the different assumptions, figure out which ones are like you're most sensitive to. And then that's where you kind of focus your research, right, on validating the assumptions that are going to have the biggest impact. I mean, it seems that's a little bit different from perhaps, the question that is most interesting from a scientific perspective. Do public health officials think in that way? They think about, prioritizing which of the different assumptions they're going to test?
I think there's increasingly, I think the dialogue, I think there's a lot more kind of movement between those communities, which I think is very helpful. And we had it increasingly in the pandemic being asked, what studies should we be running? And so, even as we started getting vaccines, studies that can tell us how well vaccines work against new variants was like, okay, that's one of the number one things we need to have in place. And I think it is, as you said, that even that process of just writing down, how do I think this process works? And which bits can I put numbers on and which bits can't I? And how do I go out and find out the things? And so I think some people have this idea, particularly academics, that models is all like, you build all the assumptions and you do lots of simulations. And actually, a relatively small amount of our work during COVID was actually those kind of forward, big number, future worst case scenario type simulations. And a lot more of it was actually, how do we get information we care about? So even things like, for example, if you get infected and I give you a PCR test 2 days later, what's the probability you'll test positive? So there's lots of nice kind of cohort data sets where people were collecting these things. There's MBA in the US, there was a number of healthcare workers in the UK. So a lot of our work was thinking, okay, can we define a model for that testing process of who's being tested when and what the underlying, viral shedding might be? And then can we just estimate these things? So when they're going to design a policy of doing daily tests on people, for example, we have some numbers that we can put into it. So you always get a cycle of, we want to, the model helps us understand what we don't know, then we go and work with various kind of cohort studies to get that data and then put it back in so we can say something more useful.
Well, from your work, I've learned that gambling and disease, right, we're driving a lot of mathematical and statistical discovery. Could you talk a bit about, go back to Ronald Ross, who is, I guess, somewhere involved in the school in which you teach. How he sort of created this discipline of epidemiology, really, and how it has really spread to finance and marketing. I think today you can't really do finance or marketing if you don't understand a bit about, epidemiology, at least at a folk level.
Yeah, and this it's a fascinating story. So Ronald Ross, I think, like many researchers in the UK and Europe and US in the sort of late 1800s, worked a lot on malaria because that was that big tropical disease that a lot of the people going out to colonial areas, coming back, created a lot of burden. But it wasn't very well understood at the time. There were these kind of different theories, and when he was in the Indian medical service as a doctor, and I think he got quite frustrated with the mosquitoes and sort of started to get rid of them just because they're biting. Didn't know that there was a link between them and the disease. And he got kind of told off by his senior, say, "Look, leave them be. Don't mess with nature." But over time, he started to kind of realize that there was some importance, and but even just that process, initially they found the malaria parasite in the mosquito, and there's a question of, okay, so how does it get into a person? And for a while they thought that what happened is people drank water that mosquitoes were breeding in, and then got it that way. So they ran these not very ethical studies, perhaps in hindsight, of just getting people to drink water with a bunch of dead mosquitoes in, and unsurprisingly they didn't get malaria. And then eventually he isolated it from the saliva gland, and that got a Nobel Prize. But then it raised that question, well, what do you do about it? And he was really adamant that he was controlling the mosquitoes. But I think a lot of the kind of folk wisdom at the time was, well, you can't get rid of every single last mosquito from an area. So if you can't get rid of every single last mosquito, it's pointless, because there's still going to be some, you're still going to have malaria. And so Ross, who was a self-taught mathematician, started developing these very simple models. And essentially what it boiled down to is he looked at the rates at which people are getting infected and the rate that people who are infectious are recovering. And he realized that if you get rid of enough mosquitoes, what happens is the rate at which new people are getting infected is lower than the rate at which they're recovering from being infectious. So in other words, you're going to get an epidemic that starts declining because the new cases are slower than the ones that are recovering and stop being infectious. And that concept is kind of the core of all the epidemiological models we work with. It's this idea of why do epidemics peak? It's not because everybody gets infected. It's basically because transmission isn't fast enough. The rate of new cases isn't fast enough to kind of overcome the ones that are recovering. And Ronald Ross actually viewed that as his most significant work. So he won a Nobel Prize for identifying the link, but he said it was his contributions to the mathematical theory of epidemics and the idea that you could think about the processes and make this argument. And now we know, vector control for a lot of these types of pathogens is what we do, and there's enormous innovation now for other infections trying to target it. But then he didn't just stop at diseases. He had this wonderful term, theory of happenings. So he said things just happen, and he divided it into two examples. So one was what he said were things that kind of happened at random. So to some extent, things like accidents and just random life events. But then there's also a group that what he called dependent happenings. So if it happening to you depends on it happening to someone that you know, and you get these kind of patterns. And the shapes are quite different. That actually, if you look at over time, or even like by different ages, for example, what you see with a dependent happening is you'll often increase quite steeply because a lot of people will be susceptible to, whether it's an idea, an innovation, a disease. So you'll get this kind of exponential growth at the start. But then what happens is you're infectious with your idea, your infection. You start encountering people who've already come across it. So although you might be out there potentially spreading it, a lot of those people are just sort of dead-end hosts. And so then you get that kind of this S-shape. And a lot of the Everett Rogers and all the theory about diffusion of innovations that would come later exactly is this kind of S-shaped curve of an innovation takes off and then it starts to saturate. And as you said, finance as well. I think working on that book, I was quite surprised talking to, for example, people in the Bank of England, that this wasn't a kind of loose analogy, that actually a lot of this theory of epidemics and networks and contagion in 2008 would really be at the core of their thinking about who's at risk. And even to some extent, the credit crisis was this idea of, I don't know where this contagion is. And that kind of influences your behavior in a way similar that if you've got a disease epidemic, if you don't know where the infection is, you're going to be a bit cautious and the knock-on effects that can have.
Yeah, I mean, to me, someone who's been teaching finance for most of my life, it was kind of shocking to me that the notion of contagion was considered relatively new by so many people in the world of finance as of 2008, right? I mean, because such an obvious application of this insight.
Yeah, and I think so. Talking to Andy Haldane, who was the chief economist Bank of England, I think he said one of the reasons that it took a while to take off was it was kind of smooth waters, and it was this idea that okay, maybe system level risk kind of really matters, but when things were all fairly steady, there was just a lot more interest in focusing institution by institution. It was unfortunately only when things got into trouble that people realized that, oh wow, like Lehman are really intertwined in this network, and that's going to go really far.
But it's also the math is a lot easier, right? So if you're an insurance company, it's a lot easier to model a world where death is happening, right? That's independent, and it becomes a little bit more difficult when you introduce sort of an infectious disease or clustering of accidents and so forth. I mean, to what extent does sort of, I don't know, computational ease, how much does that influence how people interpret the world?
I think it makes a big difference. I mean, I think both just on the intuitive side that, we all have inevitably just to function in life, we have to make simplifications and abstractions. Even some of it, for example, like the concept of if you roll a dice, that's not a random process. If you think about it, it's a physics process. There's just a bunch of motion that's driving that. But to all intent and purposes, understanding it and working it out and predicting it is kind of just beyond us in everyday life. So we just simplify it as that's a random event. And I think there's a lot of things where that works entirely sensibly, but then you get some things that can really kind of lead us astray. And I think one example is things that involve exponentials, that a lot of our daily life is linear, that, if you buy, twice as many groceries, it costs you twice as much. Whereas you don't have something where if you buy twice as many groceries, it suddenly costs you 4 times. Well, I'd hope you're not shopping at somewhere that does that. But there's all these things that in certain aspects can really be very disconnected from what a lot of that intuition is. And I think, on the computation side as well, in some cases it can cause, I think a lot of it as well is just creeping assumptions. One of the things I found fascinating was a lot of the credit derivatives pricing. So a lot of the kind of mortgage products where they were kind of wrapping up and reselling debt. A lot of the kind of equation for the default originally came from, it was some work on what's known as broken heart syndrome. So the idea that if you have someone who loses a spouse, it increases their risk. It's kind of actuarial risk. But as it sort of carried across fields, a lot of the correlation between the events, that assumption kind of got lost a bit along the way. So again, it was this idea that you can have these defaults, but the correlation isn't going to behave in a way that suddenly everyone's going to default on their mortgage at the same time, which obviously there's many external events that can make that a lot more likely.
Well, I know a lot of friends who are physicists and mathematicians who have found a career in finance, but you don't hear about a lot of epidemiologists right, finding a career in finance. Is there now maybe a little bit more, I don't know, consulting of epidemiologists by finance professionals, hedge funds, and so forth?
I think certainly in 2008 there was more, I think, from kind of governments and central banks, because it was effectively more from a kind of understanding and control and regulation side of things. And I suspect a lot of the market is very much around the more kind of massive. I mean, I think now as well, anything that's tied into predictions. So I suppose traditionally a lot of kind of models are random processes, and then coming into the modern era, things that can give you decent predictions on data. So I suppose in terms of you're probably better insight than I have here, but I mean certainly in terms of making money, understanding that contagion process as its kind of full complexity is probably less important than just be able to make predictions about what specific individuals or events will do.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people who are trading, they have an intuitive understanding of contagion, but they don't rely on formal models, I don't think, as much as they do for, say, asset pricing, typical asset pricing.
And I think one of the big the things as well, talking to kind of central bankers, is just the data availability, that actually a lot of this kind of transaction network you don't have visibility. I mean, I think that was one of the problems in 2008. That
Right.
actually, there was a lot of these kind of over-the-counter trades that just nobody had some understanding of where the exposures were. So even if you really wanted to set out and make that a strategy, you don't have the data in a way that you might be able to get for a biological infection, actually see how different countries are doing. And probably some of the key insights you'd need to understand someone's exposure, that's just not public information.
Right. So it's not like when you have publications with co-authors, right? There you can kind of map out influence. Or even with the pandemic, there were a lot of public health officials who were looking at phone data, right? So, to what extent could you map out these contagion vectors and networks using things like phone data?
Yeah, so there was a lot of work, I mean, at different levels as well. So yeah, some was on the mobility. So I mean, we did some work with kind of Google data and metadata. Even just thinking about kind of different spatial areas of how quickly you're going to get to different places. What happens if you have restrictions on one area? I mean, actually, the UK was really interesting because what you can do is if you've got movement data, you can think about community sizes. So broadly, you can define a community as you mix with more people, you're more likely to mix with people within that community than outside it. So if you've got like a city, generally it behaves that most of the interaction will happen, there'll be less outside. But when restrictions came in, we noticed that the number of communities in the UK, as defined by this kind of data measure, skyrocketed. Because basically what happened is people stopped commuting. Everyone just stuck in their little local area. So that's one thing that can be quite useful. The other as well, of course, is evaluating controls. So there's been a lot of nice work by Oxford in particular on the COVID app in the UK. So this was the app that kind of pings you if you've been near someone. And it was designed to be anonymous, but for that kind of app to work, it has to interact with a central system at the point of getting a test, because you don't want to just say, I want to ping people, because obviously that's going to lead to a lot of potentially bad actors. So you have to kind of get a test, and the test has to be positive, and then it notifies. And they use that to get a lot of understanding of if you're exposed to people for longer, what does that mean? And I think that there's a really interesting debate there that's beyond just epidemiology of if we want to control these kind of problems, you need data on where people are and who they've interacted with. But that's obviously extremely sensitive information. So we see some countries, I mean, Taiwan, one example, was using kind of digital ring fencing. So if you're in quarantine, you try and leave your house, it pings the authorities. And other countries were very hands-off. It's like, we just don't want any of that kind of data. And again, it's beyond the reach of just science there. But yeah, it's really a lot of potentially valuable insights, but understandably a lot of privacy concerns as well.
Right. So, I mean, if you're going to do an intervention that is designed to slow down the spread of an infectious agent, you really need to understand the kind of network architecture of the society, right? So that you can figure out like where are the points where you can intervene and get the biggest bang for your buck. Do we now know more about kind of the network architecture of a typical society than we did at the time of the pandemic?
I think we have some, and this was actually one of the big tensions in a lot of the design of these technological solutions. So some places like Singapore use this kind of, we're going to get the network approach. And they, as well as the apps you had, if you didn't have the app, you had to have a little Bluetooth token. So you got a lot more understanding of actually the full network structure, understandably very sensitive data. Somewhere like the UK and a lot of Europe and the kind of Google and Apple protocols didn't want that. They didn't want some central knowledge of that network. So instead, it's much more what we call egocentric, in that you've got your app and it knows which other phones it's been near, but there's nobody in government or in a public health agency who can view that whole network. All they can view is individuals who've been pinged and how many contacts that person's had. So you never got that full insight in a way, but you can obviously infer things just about the risk kind of per person. I think we've done a lot of work over the years trying to piece together networks. We did one with the BBC back in 2017, 2018 with colleagues at Cambridge, and that we got a town essentially to download an app and track movement. So this is all kind of consented with participants, and that you got very fine scale, so you could really understand all of that kind of network structure, which we used a lot for COVID. But again, it's that trade-off that to get adherence to these things, it's quite challenging if I asked to track your movements in detail. So I think there's a lot of really kind of promising work, but much more we could be done that could be done to try and understand interactions in populations and then what matters. And and not just diseases as well. There's been a lot of nice work looking at things like network structure and innovations, and how do you seed innovations within a network to try and get them to spread, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a popular conception that to the extent that people knew what R naught was, they had this view that it was like a constant, right? Instead of thinking that it was completely dependent on, not only the way the networks are configured, but the way in which the environment is configured and the policies that you have, right? So it was kind of like a dial that the policy makers would ideally like to be able to, adjust at will, but it was, I guess not very well understood exactly how you could modify that thing.
Yeah, and I like to think of it as it almost as these components that, if you're infected, the R naught is the how, or the effective reproduction number is just how many people you eventually give it to. And there's a few steps that are required for you to get that. Depends on how long you're infectious for, depends on how many people you interact with, masks and things you might be wearing, depend on whether they're vaccinated or they have things that might prevent them getting the infection at the other end. And it gives us these different levers. And obviously early in COVID, we didn't have can we vaccinate and reduce susceptibility? So the levers were, can we just reduce social contacts, or can we try and isolate people? Can we try and introduce masks? And obviously understanding, some of those levers you might pull really hard and it doesn't give you as much as you want. Some you pull, but it's extremely expensive to do that, and you don't want to do it for very long. I mean, we thought quite a lot about this, almost kind of idea of budgets that you have. If you've got an uncontrolled outbreak, the reproduction numbers up here, you want to pull a bunch of levers and get it low enough for the decline. But in many cases, that meant you kind of had to get rid of sort of 75% of your transmission from somewhere. And there weren't good combinations of options to do that. So I think whether you're talking about an infectious disease, or even if you're thinking about getting something to take off, I mean, it's a question I get asked a lot of just, how do you get content to be more? And I think a lot of people think about the content, but obviously if something goes viral, it's not just about the content. It's not about what you've written. It's about the network through which it's spreading. It's about the susceptibility of that network. It's about the medium you use. Do you have it that lingers somewhere? Is it just something you stick on a feed and it kind of vanishes? So there's a direct analogy there with the different elements and how they trade off in ultimately what you see in terms of spread.
Now, when you're doing disease response, you're trying to kind of prevent something from spreading, but all those folks in marketing, right, they're trying to get stuff to spread, right? So when did this happen? When did the insights from epidemiology make their way over into the world of idea transmission?
There's been quite a few examples over the year where people have tried to do this in different ways. So a lot of the work in innovations, again, just trying to map out these shapes. If you look at like adoption of technologies, it's amazing that they all kind of, they sort of accelerate and then plateau in this really predictable way. And it was actually going back to Ronald Ross. He did some work trying to think through almost at the acceleration of where is that most rapid growth as something takes off. And Everett Rogers, who later did stuff in diffusion of innovations, he said something had sort of taken off once about 20% or so of the population had adopted it. And Ross actually, if you go through his equations, the fastest growth of an innovation is actually at that point if you use these kind of simple models. So it's a really nice example of theory working its way through. But again, there's a simple model there, but still a little bit descriptive. There was some, again, work on sales of things like televisions and trying to work out when they would peak from some of these. Academic citations was another area for a lot of early work, just because you can measure it. You know who's written a paper and where it's been cited. But I think some of the strongest examples of kind of engineering this were really in the noughties in terms of viral content online. So BuzzFeed, for example, Jonah Peretti, who founded that, did a lot of experimentation, but also worked on the theory. So people like Duncan Watts, who pioneered a lot of the work around small world networks and these kind of connections, they actually used concepts around reproduction numbers to evaluate the contagiousness of a marketing campaign. Because obviously, if you run, say you run an email campaign that reaches 1,000 people, and then you run the same campaign that reaches 2,000 people, it doesn't actually mean that at the individual level it's twice as contagious. Because if you think about it, because each step might go on and on, it actually only needs to be a little bit more contagious to get that additional exponential reach. And one of the things I found fascinating talking to somebody who, well, it's actually somebody who reviewed my book who used to work for BuzzFeed. He said when they wrote articles, they had this metric evaluating the success of their article, and it was just a version of the reproduction number, basically. So it was really at the core of their company. And yeah, BuzzFeed and Huffington Post that Peretti was involved in were like amongst the most shared websites on the internet during that early period. They were really, really good at getting things to take off. And it was epidemiology that they kind of had at the core, kind of understanding how things actually spread, how you get it seeded in populations, how do you get that kind of onward transmission.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like when you're talking about innovation like a dishwasher, I mean, there, like the infectious period sort of goes on forever. Like,
yeah.
Whereas with the BuzzFeed articles, the infectious period is very momentary, right? So, if you don't forward that article within the first few minutes after seeing it, you're probably never going to forward it. But if you own a dishwasher, every time you meet somebody who doesn't have a dishwasher, you're going to be like, check this thing out. So the infectious period is almost infinite for innovations.
And there was a really interesting Facebook study a few years ago where they looked at different modes of transmission. So, on your profile on social media, if you put something on your profile picture, that's there for a while. If you pin something to your profile, it's not, lifetime, but it's going to be there for days or weeks. And obviously, if you just post something, it disappears into the feed. But they looked at all this popular content and these different mechanisms that people were sharing it. And the average amount of transmission was the same. So in other words, you've got some things like if you pin it or if you have it in your profile that is quite a long period of infectiousness, but it doesn't seem to be that infectious. Whereas you get some stuff that someone dumps a post on a feed. And even though people will just scroll past it, those in particular bits of content had a much higher transmissibility. So it was a much shorter window, but it was kind of offset by the fact it was much more shareable.
Now, did epidemiologists who are fighting COVID, were they consciously using insights from epidemiology to, disseminate messages, right? And ideas and insights, right? And maybe using the same insights to maybe suppress bad information or, false news or false data?
Yeah, that's so I certainly wasn't using it in quite that an engineered way, but I think having written a book and thought a lot about it, it made me think a lot about kind of healthy interactions with online content. So one, if you look at the content itself, some of the most powerful drivers of sharing are basically strong emotional responses. So things like disgust and anger, things that for evolutionary reasons, there's a kind of logic of disgust, there's a survival instinct, anger, who's good, who's bad. There's a lot of kind of deep-rooted kind of social reasons that we value that kind of information. So it made me quite conscious that, yes, every now and again you'd post something in a bit of a frustrated way and it would take off. And actually that's it is getting traction, but in a really unhealthy way. And I think the other thing that I noticed a lot was, groups who want to get messages amplified will often do it in quite a designed fashion. So they might, for example, target high-profile accounts, their target media accounts, try and get that kind of dissemination into wider networks. You see it quite often. It's known as astroturfing, where you have a lot of accounts that kind of surround politicians and create this idea that there's grassroots support for something. So I think having that knowledge, I and others got more familiar with some of these tactics and not getting kind of dragged into them, and essentially just becoming part of that snowball process. I think one of the things that I tried to do a lot though was thinking it was almost the kind of susceptibility to message that as the pandemic went on, you could kind of, because we think a lot about epidemiology, anticipate which the things that people are going to want to know about. So whether it's kind of vaccines coming in, whether it's new variants, and actually kind of preparing content, knowing that there's going to be demand for kind of better understanding of some of those issues. So again, thinking about the different components, some of these posts that 6 months earlier, people would have been like, don't get that, that's too complicated. Anticipating that you're going to get this kind of boost in susceptibility to a message in what I hope is quite a useful way, because it just, here's a new issue and actually here's some content which allows you just to get a better understanding of what you're seeing.
Well, you also have some great stuff in there about computer viruses, right? And I mean, we even use the term virus and antivirus, right? And so are people at, say, public health institutions like yours, I mean, are they helping out with the folks involved in cybersecurity? I mean, should we be thinking about the science of networks and the science of transmission as a unified field rather than one that has to do with medicine, one that has to do with cybersecurity, one that has to do with finance, one that has to do with, marketing and so forth?
I think so. There's been a lot of work in this area, like over the last couple of decades in particular, and I think in a way we've got to the point where I think that would have been true in the past, but now, because so many theories around networks, for example, have become so well established across so many fields. Yes, if you talk to someone who used to be in Facebook's data science team, for example, or talk to somebody who works a lot on internet security or works for a central bank, and 20 years ago, the diversity of knowledge about networks is probably quite different. But now, a lot of them will know all of those kind of basics and be able to kind of swap understanding a lot of those discussions. But I think it's kind of a good way that you haven't got this kind of centralized expertise, but actually you've got kind of ideas flowing in different directions. And I think, again, computer viruses, or as I said, a lot of research in the book, a lot of them aren't technically viruses. A lot of the ones we talk about, they're often worms, because viruses, much like a real virus, you need something for it to survive inside. It can't just, it's not a program that can replicate by itself. It needs to kind of, essentially infect something on your machine that can replicate for it. But there was a lot of really interesting theory about why these things persist. But I think a lot of the work as well in trying to, understand countermeasures is things that are kind of directly informed. Because one thing that's really interesting about computer systems is the variation in contacts you see in the network is enormous. You basically get some hubs that are just connected to a huge amount of computers, and some are connected to very few at all. So that makes the transmission much burstier. It's not like, so humans have some variation in their contacts, but most people have about 10 contacts a day in terms of like conversations or people they exchange words with. Some more, some less, but you don't have people generally have like 10,000 contacts in a day. Whereas in computers, you can have that. So it makes the potential for some things to actually persist at quite low levels for quite a long time, because it will kind of hit this application and then simmer along, and then hit another one and simmer along. So again, similarly with online content, sometimes the sort of problems and questions that we would get for, say, human infections actually don't apply, and then you start to get that kind of separation where you actually need people who think about these kind of hub spoke networks in this way.
But there doesn't seem to be like a regulatory equivalent of, say, the Federal Reserve for computers, right? So, we have folks in public health who are monitoring diseases, right? Keeping their eyes out for Ebola and Zika and so forth, and understanding transmission dynamics. And now we have folks in the world of finance that are thinking about this. But it seems like AWS, if AWS went down, this would be the equivalent of, Lehman Brothers plus Morgan Stanley, plus Goldman Sachs, all going down at the same time. And I don't know whether we have any single regulator that has a sense of how all of these different computers are tied together.
I think that's a great question. Yeah, I don't know exactly where we are with that. As you mentioned, there are these kind of platforms like AWS, which it is just kind of remarkable how much the internet runs it. And although their uptime is really high, there have been situations where it's gone down, and some of it, I think one of my favorite examples in the book of it was quite a simple bit of malware that actually emerged. It was, I think it was Minecraft servers, actually. It was this idea that, Minecraft, you have to pay to go on different servers. So if you can sort of take down someone else's server, it helps you. And it just got out of hand, and it was going through the Internet of Things. So it's basically like kettles and toasters were generating these directed denial of service attacks on these just enormous platforms that should have been able to handle that. But just the scale of it just got completely ridiculous. And so in those situations, you realize that the AWS, just so many bits of your house and your life run through some of those platforms. So I think the kind of centralization is an issue, and it might be one that in future we need to put more thought into, that actually have we just got these really big failure points potentially that we're very heavily relying on.
And you also talked about this little bit of code that has been sort of cut and pasted so many times, right? And then when it's kind of removed from the system, it causes everything to collapse.
Yeah, you get, particularly in even the apps you use on your phone, a lot of them rely on open source libraries. So rely on, somebody's built a Python or C++ thing back in the day, and some of them do quite complicated things, but some of them might just have a little bit of code just to put numbers in order or something. And just, somebody's used it and then someone else has used it and built on it. And you get this kind of, this chain. It's like a kid's game of like pass the message on. And what happens is you can get quite important bits of software, not realizing that you're reliant on that thing. And the situation a few years ago, again, it was one of these, I think it was a simple number sourcing algorithm, but someone just decided they didn't want their code to be available anymore and just took it down. And it was this like, dominoes, everything subsequently just suddenly stopped working because no one had realized that you've had this spread of this key bit of information.
So, I mean, you could have something like the NotPetya virus, which was specifically targeting, I guess, Ukrainian public sector computers, which escapes from, that community and just causes everything to collapse. And I think there was if I remember correctly, there was a company, Maersk, that did sort of a lockdown and told everybody to shut down all their computers. And there was one computer somewhere in Africa which had the entire database intact, and they were able to repopulate all of the other computers. But it was only because the transmission dynamic had been arrested by, I think there was a power outage or something in Ghana, and so they couldn't, it couldn't get infected. So, I mean, ideally, if there was a outbreak like that, you'd want the equivalent of public health officials who could go in and say, okay, here's how we can arrest the spread. Here's how we can, lock down certain parts of the interconnected network. But I don't think anybody's in a position to do that. Nobody has sort of a complete map of the network or the grid.
Not that I'm aware of. And we see, every few years, there was some in the UK in recent years where big computer systems have gone down in different ways. And suddenly, I think it's that realization that's kind of like the banking network. Everyone realizes that there's just much more connectivity and potential for failure. But no, it's not gone the same way. I think one of the big challenges as well is just the timescale involved, that a biological infection, to some extent, you're working on the biological timescale. So for some things like flu and COVID, it's pretty quick. It's like a few days if you get infected someone else. But if you look at, like, for some of those computer viruses, the time for it to kind of double is, just blink of an eye type stuff. So as you mentioned, some of those examples that kind of take down companies, by the time you work out the person you want to ring up to fix it, it could go. So almost, I think we need to be thinking much more about these kind of autonomous processes that can kind of detect and check. Even online contagion as well. I think a lot of these interventions, things like community notes on Twitter, there's a lot of studies that have shown that actually they tend to converge on quite accurate summaries. But the problem is they're just really slow. That by the time that a community, I think the average is, or a year or two ago, it was about 12, 14 hours, I think. So it's like, you can imagine that something's just completely taken off, gone around the world, and then the correction gets added a bit too late to do a huge amount of good.
Now, last question. I remember you started off, I think, the book on proof with the Monty Hall story. And I remember in my operations class, I think it was in 1990, when the instructor came out with and told us, I didn't realize how new it was at the time, and he showed us, he proved through simulation. Right? This was my first actual simulation that I had to create, using software. And that was pretty convincing. But there were a lot of mathematicians that weren't convinced, right? And so it seems like simulation is a type of proof that in some ways comes on naturally to some mathematicians, but we're relying much more on it for proof in today's world. So what is it about simulation as a way of demonstrating something which is, I don't know, a little bit less convincing perhaps than some kind of proof by exhaustion or proof by...
It's a really interesting one, yeah. The Monty Hall is that example. I think even when I came across it when I was younger, and I kind of convinced myself, and my assumption was like, okay, I'll just show that to someone else and they'll be convinced too. And then I realized over time that some of these things people find really good, and some, you're like, how are you not convinced by that? And it's this
Right.
this kind of disconnect. And in
So
some cases,
in other
you
words,
say
you're infectious, but they're not susceptible, right?
Yeah.
You can't convince them.
completely. And you often don't realize that. I think there's so many situations in life where we've convinced ourselves of something and just don't realize that it's just what we've got is just not convincing for other people. And I think we see that in a lot of things. So I think there's sometimes that element of being able to try things out, which people quite like, versus kind of here's a bunch of equations or theory. But it has been quite a controversial area in parts of kind of maths and proof, because ultimately a simulation is probabilistic. You might simulate many times, but you're not proving it with 100% confidence. We're saying, yeah, I've done 100,000 simulations and that's what it came out. But there's always that kind of chance. And there was, even in areas of maths, there were these things of some of these very hard computational problems of, if you've got an enormous number, is this a prime number, for example? And actually trying to crunch through and show that definitively is really hard. But you could use these probability-based tricks to say, we're almost 100% confident it's a prime number, and like maybe that's good enough. And there's some of the community said, well, actually no, I'm not happy with that. I want it to be 100%. And then I think you got a lot more people who are being pragmatic, and we've seen that a lot in AI actually, in a lot of the game playing. So a few years ago, great piece of research announced poker is solved. So by that they meant they'd identified a strategy which was essentially unbeatable in the long run. Could not lose even to the best humans. But there was a p-value on it, because they said, we're this confident that it's solved. Like, we can't, because it's simulation based and it's AI and it's had to learn, we can't be 100% certain that it will never lose, but we're almost there. And I think now, just because we've seen just the scope of problems that we can tackle in these ways, I think that there is more of that pragmatism, that people are kind of happy to say, okay, we've got a level of confidence that's useful. But it was controversial, because I think people are kind of giving up that tool they had that could give them some certainty, and having to move to a world where you're highly confident rather than certain.
There are some people that just want their closed form solution, and they're not going to be happy until they get it, right?
I noticed even in my day job a sort of transition over time as, compute became easier and cheaper, and it's just quicker. So even now I'll have statistical problems where it's like, I'm pretty sure I could sit down for an hour and just work this out properly, or I can just do a 5-minute simulation just to convince myself that that's doing what I think it's doing.
Right.
And, under pressure, knowing you're not getting something totally wrong in a simulation is sometimes as useful as trying to deal with the elegant maths.
So a lot of the AI is kind of like, we know that if we get rid of the mosquitoes, the malaria goes down. We just don't know why, because we haven't discovered the parasite yet. And
there's that fascinating, talking to people involved in some things like protein prediction, and those are just amazingly powerful tools. You can take a sequence and you can think about how that folds up into a protein. But there's that why, that explanation isn't there. And I think some people who've grown up with science, and myself as well, there's almost a bit of that sense of loss, because you want the science, you want the elegance, you want that discovery. But I think also we need to be realistic that these are extremely complex biological processes, and there might not be a simple, neat explanation we can write in a sentence. But if we've got a tool that can give us predictions that we can develop treatments off the back of, that's a really good, Nobel Prize winning thing to have. I think there is that's the sort of transition we're going through, I think, for many people of, well, what is science? How much does it bother us that we've got explanation when we've got predictions that can be very helpful?
Well, Adam, thanks so much for joining me. The latest book is called Proof, The Art and Science of Certainty. Thanks so much. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much for having me.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.